Mike Emmerich. I'm the director of the school. And we're here tonight for Back to School with Rick and Doeschate. And with a contribution of Lara Schrijver in this session. Just to tell you really briefly something about the school, because as you might have known, we're not maybe the regular school that you would have expected. We always say like we're a school for people who already went to school, so we organize courses, public events, shorter workshops for professionals that are working on the city, from architects to sociologists to urban planners to historians, but really everybody that kind of professionally engages with the city. And this is a series that we're organizing. We started it actually, we did one sequence or one series of this lecture series before, Back to School with, during which we invite someone to curate a series of 3 lectures, 3 evening sessions around a certain topic that's currently on their mind. So we pick someone that we think is interesting, that's working on something cool, and we ask them like, hey, who would you invite if you get to curate a series of 3? And this time we asked Rick and Doeschate of CIVIC Architects, and he came up with this topic to curate the series about the topic of representation in architecture. And just to introduce Rick quickly, he's one of the co-founders of CIVIC Architects, together with Ingrid van der Heijden, Jan Lebbink, and Gert Bekkeboom. And with CIVIC, they focus on the production of public architecture, and probably you might know their work from the Lokhal in Tilburg, which is a public library in Tilburg and close to the central station. And that won quite a lot of prizes and has been in the media a bit. And since the founding of their office in 2015, they've worked on various public buildings, so cultural buildings, town halls, bridges, dikes, squares, libraries, educational and residential buildings, streets, sculptures, and stations in some way or the other, right?
Yeah.
And amongst some of them are the design of the Shoe Museum in Waaldijk as well, which was finished last year. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And currently on the way is a university building in the Twente University as well. A lot of reuse, and I think Rick will also show some pictures of it. And on their website, they write that CIVIC believes in architecture by research, and they want to combine proven technology with new ideas, merging thinking with design, theory with practice, and urbanism with detailing. So going through all the skills and through the various disciplines in architecture. And for them, also focusing on architecture or on public architecture is also a way to turn theoretical ambitions into physical reality. And when you design a public building, this question of representation, of course, often comes up because you do design for the public or for a bigger audience. And that's also what we are going to talk about. Tonight, we're going to talk about the historical perspective with Lara Schrijver. You will introduce her further and introduce the topic a little bit further. Then we'll continue this conversation on the 25th of April. And that speaker is still pending, but we hope to announce it soon. And then we finalize this series on the 16th of May. And for that, we've invited Charles Holland, who was one of the founders of FAT Architecture, Fashion Architecture Taste, right? And he was part of FAT together with, amongst others, Sam Jacob. And currently has his own practice, Charles Holland Architects. So that's a bit of context and a bit of introduction of Rick. I really hope you will have a nice evening. Let's also we will have 2 presentations, but then I think we will also focus on having a conversation with this group of people. We're a small group, so hopefully you all feel comfortable in joining the conversation. And just one disclaimer is that Rick has fallen off his bike in Spain 2 weeks ago. So we're extremely happy that he managed to make it to get here. But also that means that we will try to wrap up the evening after 1.5, max 2 hours. I think then we will all be tired, but probably you especially. So, well, Rick, give the floor to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm officially old now. I broke my hip. Let's see how I will do this. Okay. Like, there are non-Dutch speakers here, right? We're not doing this. Okay, good. So I will introduce this series a bit and use some of our own projects to explain our exploration on this topic. And I'd like to start with the goodbye speech of Bernard Kolenbrander, who was my former professor in Eindhoven, and he gave his farewell speech in this winter, I think. And in it, he praised buildings that are, in his words, 100% architecture, like this Wim Quist building in Diemen, which is kind of the result of an interplay of abstract shapes. And while glorifying autonomous architecture, he kind of ridicules architects that attempted to achieve things outside of the territory of architecture itself. And he makes fun of UN Studio, for instance, and it's kind of funny how he does it. It's also a bit cynical, but it's also funny. He explains how Ben van Berkel explains this staircase as a way to achieve 3 layers of health. While this staircase on the right, that looks kind of similar, which is from 10 years ago, was supposedly achieving a super fluent traffic flow. Also, he's making fun of architects that kind of cloak their design by a lot of PR terminology, basically. And according to Kolenbrander, architects should focus more on like hardcore architectural issues like composition and tectonics and materials. And while it's all a bit cynical, he does have a point, I think. Like last decades, we've been mainly discussing conceptual architecture. And you could argue that that we were kind of talking about a lot of big societal themes, but we didn't know really how to address them. So there's this, lately there's this group of architects that have been refocusing on what you could call hardcore architecture lately in the Netherlands. And they're saying like they're not very interested in conceptual architecture. And they're saying we should focus on these intra-architectural themes. And they're also saying, they're implying that architecture has little to achieve outside of the territory of architecture. And what is quite admirable is that their work is almost always of high quality. But what I personally find a bit risky is that they're implying that working on sort of hardcore architecture automatically means working within the European tradition, as if other styles are automatically kind of superficial. And what I find almost problematic is that the fact that they sort of imply an opposition between architecture that just focuses solely on architecture and architecture that tries to achieve certain things outside of architecture, that tries to contribute to society, basically. And I personally think that that opposition is just false. I think architecture can contribute to society, and I think that it can contribute to society actually by focusing on these sort of intra-architectural themes. And that's one of the reasons, you could say, why we founded CIVIC, like a small 10 years ago. Because we like to focus on the public value of architecture. We mainly do that by working on public buildings. And one of these public buildings is the Lokhal. Another one, like Mike just mentioned, is the Shoe Museum in Waalwijk. And with these types of projects, we try to kind of explore how, by looking at these themes that I've mentioned, like tectonics, materials, composition, representation, how we can contribute to things that are happening in society, and vice versa, how things that are happening in society can influence the way that our architecture looks. And a good example of that is this project that we're working on right now. This is a university building in Twente, in Enschede. And what you see here is the old structure of a chemical laboratory. And we're transforming this old structure into the faculty building for geophysics, geoengineering. And one of the goals of the users and of the UT, of the university, was to make a building that's highly sustainable and also in some way represent this sustainability. So here what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of make the formal expression of the architecture that we're designing interact with this ambition to make a very sustainable building. So we're trying to achieve what I just described. We're trying to not make these things be in opposition, but try to somehow make them interact. And it all starts with working with this existing structure. So this is a picture of the existing building before we did anything to it. And our decision was to kind of radically reuse this structure instead of demolishing it and making a new building. And we do that by literally cutting it open and creating 4 atriums. Here you see a picture of the demolition phase. And with these cuts, we're creating 4 atriums that you see here in a sort of floor plan. So one here, which is sort of the entrance atrium, and 3 garden atriums, you could call them. And the architecture itself is kind of the result of the preservation of this existing structure that's 50 years old and that has all sorts of bumps and imperfections, and we embrace those. And you see here, so here we cut away all these floors, but you see the structure that continues to run through these newly created open spaces. And this existing structure interacts with the new layer that we add, which is mainly in wood, which you see interact with this existing structure, kind of folds around it and under it and over it. And then, so yeah, the green atriums, here we also cut away floors and we cut away ceilings. And everything that you see here is sort of the result of this interaction between sustainability and architecture, the formal expression of architecture. These atriums, they bring in obviously daylight, which was very necessary in this super deep building. It's like 40 meters wide and 220 meters deep. It brings in natural light, it brings in air, fresh air, and it brings in green. And for instance, the shape here of this atrium roof, it's a V-shaped roof and it kind of looks funny, but it's actually literally a result of the fact that this atrium roof collects all the water that falls on it. And when it rains, there's going to be like a little waterfall running into this atrium. So it's an example of our attempts to kind of give a formal expression to this theme of sustainability. Another theme that's just as important, another theme in society, is inclusivity. And it's kind of a complex theme. I'm not here to define it. What I just want to say is that for public buildings, it's super important to be like accessible, recognizable, meaningful to different types of people. But how? I guess there's several levels to it. One of the levels is representation in the design process. You know, the fact that architecture offices are diverse enough, that the people that participate in the design process are a diverse group, that decision makers are diverse, and that they reflect the diversity in society. This is highly important. You could sort of see this as in opposition to the classical idea of the brilliant, genius, male white architect. We don't really believe in that. I surely am not one of those. But the fact is, it's super important, but it's not the topic of this series. Another level of inclusivity in design, in architecture, is accessibility. The idea that a building is accessible to many different people, and that there's sufficient public space in the city and also sufficient public interior space. It's what we focus on with Civic, because it's also relatively sort of easy to address. It's hard to achieve in practice, but it's relatively easy to kind of think about it and design with it. So the Lock Hall, for instance, has this continuous stair landscape, which is an extension of the public space outside. And this library is accessible to everyone, like even hobos can stay there. The only rule is that they can't sleep in the building. You don't have to buy anything to be here, you can just be here. And this space is highly flexible, so sometimes you can just study there, but it's also used as for dance recitals and for city halls. And these curtains that Petra Blaise designed play an important role there, because you see them there on the right. They can be moved all around, so the spaces kind of can be used in all sorts of ways. Another smaller example is our Pieshaven Pavilion. It's a pavilion also in Tilburg. And here we were asked to design a private restaurant. And we then proposed to actually add a sort of public platform to that restaurant on top of it. And somehow the municipality got enthusiastic and they added some budget. And now we have this elevated platform, which on the one hand kind of defines the architecture, and on the other hand adds a new public space to the city that was not there before, a public viewing platform over the harbor, because there is a harbor in Tilburg. You wouldn't expect so, but there is one. Textile city. So another example of this level of sort of accessibility related to inclusivity. But then there's the third dimension, which is the formal aspect of architecture. Like a building speaks differently to different types of people. And this we encountered while working on a public building in Utrecht. It was a tender procedure, and somebody involved actually confronted us with the fact that the sort of European architectural language that we use means very different things to some people. So as an example, we're all trained a little bit in the sort of modernistic way of designing, and glass and transparency, or a glass facade is transparent and thereby inviting. And she explained, like, maybe for you that works, but for me, I think she was Moroccan, it has a completely different meaning. It only means reflection and exclusion. And this is, well, you could say evident and obvious, but for us it was actually quite an eye-opener. And it made us think, like, hey, we should be more reflective. We should be more, we should think about this more, because to be 100% honest, we don't always do that. A last project that I'd like to show quickly, where we sort of deal with this topic, is a new project that we're working on in Brussels right now, together with BC Architects. They also have been here before. And it's in Molenbeek, the neighborhood that's quite famous for its challenges, but also for its cultural diversity. And it's a transformation of a whole ensemble of former industrial buildings. Some pictures here. So a lot of these buildings are actually quite run down. Some of them are monumental, some of them are not. And the goal of the project is to transform this into a sort of cultural meeting spot for the neighborhood. And it's quite a sensitive project, because while there's a clear lack of cultural meeting spots in Molenbeek, the neighborhood doesn't really want a sort of outsider to come up with a conceptual idea and then just implement it. Instead, they want a place to meet, and it's very important for them that the rents are low, so they can actually use it. And this kind of fed our strategy, was the basis of our strategy. So we decided, here you see all the building parts, to actually sort of radically preserve the existing buildings and not even insulate most of them. So just radically accept them how they are, including all their, again, imperfections, but in this case, even their bad climate quality. And instead of sort of shaping these buildings to the program, we actually shaped the program to the buildings. To give an example, a space that's hardly insulated is actually super suitable as a timber workshop, for instance. So we kind of reversed the entire strategy. And then we did demolish one building, or one group of buildings, which was like literally dangerously run down. So it was almost collapsing. And we removed this and we replaced it by a new building. And this new building, and these older buildings did not do that. This new building kind of connects all the existing buildings to the street. So in the former situation, this was kind of like a wall, and you could hardly get through it, and the wall was not connected to the new buildings. And this new building now connects all the existing buildings. So all the existing buildings on the site are now accessible from the street. And also, quite important, this new building functions as a sort of accessibility mechanism. So the people of the neighborhood can use this building to close off certain parts, to open other parts, and to also let some people in and other people not. And this was, again, for us quite an eye-opener. So this building is not always public for everyone. It's only accessible for some. And why is this important? Because the people that can use this building are actually not always welcome in the rest of Brussels. And here they can kind of create their own exception to the norm in a way. It can also be completely public, but that is what the building enables them to do, to kind of play around with this. So again, this is inclusivity on the level of accessibility. In terms of the formal representation of the building, again, the neighborhood spoke out and said, like, we don't want an architectural symbol or anything. We just want a good space to meet. And this kind of got us to the point where we decided to go for a relatively modest architecture that's mostly based on a circular strategy. This facade is completely made of recuperated bricks, so retrieved bricks from the buildings that we demolish. And the formal language is kind of a result of that. So the thickness of the columns, the arches, the lintels, it's all a result of working with this existing brick. And then behind this facade, there's this is a model, a physical model, a kind of surprising multifunctional space. And here again, the shape of this space is the result of this circular approach. We're working with locally harvested timber here, and we don't want to kind of process the timber too much. So we don't want to glue it, we don't want to laminate it, and that means that the timber can only be like around a meter long. And the only way to make this span without columns was with this sort of 3D arch shape. And you know, we're quite happy how it looks. It looks kind of, at least to me, kind of spectacular, but it's actually, the result of this circular approach. And of course, it's influenced by our own ideas, but still. Here, while the neighborhood is super diverse, we actually didn't really dare to go for a hyper diverse architecture. That's a one-on-one expression of all the cultures that are using the building. We went for this modest, rational architecture as a result of a circular strategy. And to be, again, fairly honest, that's also because we just don't know enough to really design with, for instance, different cultural expressions in this building. We feel that we first need to know more about it before we can really experiment with it and create a building that's actually going to be built, because this one is going to be built. So to summarize, to wrap it up, my point is that public buildings should be accessible, recognizable, meaningful to different types of people. Formal expression is one of the important aspects in that, but we hardly actually discuss it, and we don't know enough about it. I mean, do buildings need to be super diverse to reflect cultural diversity? Do they need to be super universal to kind of bind everyone together? Should they be ambiguous so people can see different things in them? We don't know, but actually you could say that the answers to these questions are political choices in architectural form. So we cannot kind of hide between either empty terminology, like, okay, our building is designed like it always has been and now it's also inclusive, or about sort of a cynical stance, like, no, this is not for us to think about, leave it up to others, we'll just do whatever we always done. I think it's too important for that, so we need to kind of dive into it a bit better, a bit further, to actually design with it. And that's the cool thing about this series. Again, we don't have answers yet, but we can use this series to explore the question a little bit. And I'm super happy that Lara Schrijver reacted positively to our question to be our first guest. We made lists, people from the school and at CIVIC, and Lara was, I think, the only one that was on both of our lists, so that was telling. Lara is a professor of architectural theory in Antwerpen. She was also in the editorial board of, among others, Oase and the Yearbook here in the Netherlands. And she wrote extensively on the relation between society and architecture. And one of the specific reasons why I wanted to ask Lara was that I encountered a book from Lara about Ungers and Koolhaas, where she also shed a light on like the formal expression of OMA's buildings, and that's actually hardly ever done. So I found that a very refreshing take. So I'm super happy that she will now follow me up with with, I hope, a great lecture.
No pressure.
Thanks.
To start with, I'm not going to have answers, just to be clear. I will probably complicate things a little more. But it is funny, I brought the book with me because indirectly, I guess this is the reason I'm here today. Which is kind of funny because some of the, I've purposely tried to take as much Koolhaas out of my lecture as I could. Minimized it. And instead, I've actually kind of dug into a kind of longer question about ideas of form and meaning. And I was really pleased to get this invitation, which came out of complete left field, because this question, representation, has never been at the center of my work, but the cloud of words that goes along with it has been. You know, beauty, tectonics, form, style, fashion, art, representation. Those are just the words that were like named in the intros. And then composition, symbolism, questions of spatial articulation. These are all things that kind of rose to the surface with work by Koolhaas and Ungers that led me to go back into history and to kind of start thinking more thoroughly about giving form to ideas, because that's where it starts. So to start today, I started with a question: representing who, what, how, and to what end? And what I want to take you through today, and I'm going to do it actually quite rapidly with a whole bunch of different examples, because I hope that will lead us into a conversation that can get a little closer to what this materializing of ideas is. Very selective history, I'll say that at the outset. High on the canon, but also with a few examples from outside. Because in a way, the canon is what shapes the discussion that we started. And at the same time, I think also those of us in university institutions are highly aware of how that canon needs to be broken up and reconstructed and reconstituted and rethought in the context of a contemporary society which has urgent architectural issues, but also urgent questions of connecting to those we build for. So on all that, I want to start with two examples, very simple ones, but they're just to show how complicated these discussions are. Neuteling's the City Hall Deventer, it's one I happened to have visited when I was in that Jaarboek editorial board, and it's a phenomenal building. It is extremely complicated. It's actually settled quite quietly in the city fabric from the outside. And then from the inside, you have this massive hall, which is open freely without any kind of admission or need to be there. Seats, bench, sofas you can sit on. But there was some fuss in the lead up to the project about how much it was actually of the people. And a city hall should be of the people. And I want to draw your attention to these things, because this, in a way, was their answer, which suits the work that they do. All of those constructions, these metal filigree insets, are fingerprints of local residents of Deventer. They were asked to come in and have their fingerprints be part of the ornament, and they became ornaments. And there's a tiny little anecdote that is told around there about how one very vocal anti-City Hall person had their middle finger printed somewhere in one of these balconies. Which goes to say that you can come up with all sorts of ideas, but it's in that process, things change as you go along. And in a way, the people in that city hall were very proud of it, but this ornamentation is something that we know that there's a story behind, but in itself, it's simply an ornament as well. And they're different and they're all individual. So that's one way to look at it. It's a very literal representative architecture. There are about 2,000 residents of Deventer in that building. It can also get a little more complicated than that. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, that was also completed in 2016 and was reviewed quite well by many critics, has also, not so long ago, by a Dutch architecture critic, Jodieke Veenstra, been held up to also show the absolute shortcomings of architectural criticism. And she actually went through many, many critiques of this building to look at what the issue was with architecture criticism and why we can't handle, why the canon cannot yet handle this language. And what was interesting in the work that she did in reviewing all this is she found that reviewers, these typical, the white male reviewers that reviewed it, were talking about the building as an alien form, as a distant form, as a dark form, as something that was reminiscent of H.R. Giger, Alien. And that the African American critics were talking about the Yoruba references in the triple stack of the crown. That the African American critics were talking about the ornamentation that referenced the Louisiana kind of wrought iron frameworks that were made by the enslaved population of Louisiana. And so she found in these different reviews of the building, she found a very different way of talking about the formal language that was put forward here. So these two examples are just my intro to say it's complicated. And to do that, I want to just go back through, because I think to me, one of the most crucial things we often forget about when we talk about form or style or fashion or tectonics is time. Buildings get put out there by architects with an intention, with an idea, with a whole plan. They come out of the social context they come in, and it's probably legible for a while, and then they last another 100 years, another 200 years. There are historians that tell us how we should see it, how we should have seen it, how we might see it if we go back to it. They outlast, and some of them are embraced. They will continue to be loved, transformed, reconfigured, and some of them fall by the wayside. So in a way, today I've kind of put out a whole spectrum of great ideas and how we materialize them to talk about how we give form to ideas and how we might at least open up the horizons. So it's a very selective history of giving form to ideas. And for that, I want to start with two icons of architecture. First off, the Essai sur l'architecture, the idea that architecture can go back to origins that are in nature, that are embraced by a mother figure, because of course, you know, we all need to be embraced by a mother figure. Won't even go into the gender connotations of that. So this is 18th century. 19th century, we're also going to origins. We have Egyptian work, we have Greco-Roman work, we go into the Renaissance, we move into the Gothic. This is called The Professor's Dream by Charles Cockerell, who in his 19th century accumulation said, I can make a kind of map, almost a geological map of all those sediments of architectural accomplishment. And in a way, I think it's emblems like this that we're still working with today when we talk about form. I mean, it's obvious that this is also inspired by the Greek temple, but it tries to sit in the forest. And so in all of these discussions, there's ideas of the primitive, there's the idea of simplicity, there is the idea of the Greco-Roman as the touchstone, although Cockerell complicates that nicely. And we keep going with this notion that everyone can read that. But I'm fairly certain that most people who were, you know, talked to about, who were discussing the Stadhuis Deventer might not be able to quite read an image like this as a touchstone of architectural production. So it's also our education that disciplines us in a way. The 18th century started that. I mean, arguably one could say that the French revolutionaries were the first to really think that we could shape people by shaping spaces. Great ideas, grand ideas, geometric forms. We are now universal, we've got brotherhood, we've got a revolution going. So we're going to appeal to scientific thought, because that's objective. We're going to appeal to Enlightenment thinking, and we're going to make sure that those grand geometries, those massive libraries, these repositories of knowledge, are absolutely overwhelmingly awesome. And all of us will want to become sitting in that library. And we'll look at geometries. We'll look at ideas that the pure sphere, the pure cone, the pure pyramid, the pure cube, the beautifully radial urban plan of Arc-et-Senans will help us as, you know, lowly people who were probably mostly still in the fields, will help us begin to become our better selves, because we will see the perfection of these rational forms. And this was absolute conviction for a while, that by continuing to order these spaces in such centralized, radial, orderly perfection, we could help people become orderly themselves. Now, I know anybody who has studied architecture has heard that before in multiple iterations over the 20th century. But it's an interesting way to see that we, as early as the 18th century, were convinced that orderly passage would help create orderly social interaction. So if we take that as the start, then we can talk about reshaping society in a variety of forms. And I will step through the 19th, the 20th centuries with a few examples in order to talk about what are the kind of triggers for these reshaping moments. Technological innovation. It's been an incredible driver. We could maybe argue that contemporary is driven by reuse. 19th century, many technological innovations. We had the rise of industrialization, and three of the most important architecture theory books, Ruskin's Seven Lamps, Semper's Der Stil, and Viollet-le-Duc's L'Entretien, both of these from 1863, this one from 1849, are all in their own way kind of addressing technology. How do we deal with this? Ruskin's a little grumpy on it. He prefers to have the laborer to, you know, pour his life and joy and emotion into the stone. He's fairly convinced that machines will never be able to create a kind of formal language that will gain empathy of those using it. Semper's a little more open. He imagines this industrial revolution and these tectonics to transform through technological innovations. And Viollet-le-Duc is a total pragmatic. You know, we can make these things all combine. It's just a matter of finding the right language to go with it. And what results in the 19th century is a plethora of experiments. Now, Ruskin, not liking the Crystal Palace. This is for railroad sheds. This has no value whatsoever. And at the same time, what you see is that many, many people visited the Crystal Palace. There was an excitement about it, and you see the kind of energy that comes out of it. Is it a formal articulation yet? Not quite sure, but it moves into formal articulations because Labrouste figures out that iron can do something incredible in a reading room. The lightness, the glazing allows it all to come in. Horta figures that steel is the right way to arch over a workers' assembly hall. That it is the language that we need for a new century of workers, of bourgeoisie, of laborers coming together, and of being aware that the social fabric is changing. And in this changing social fabric, architects will take the lead. And even behind facades that might not suggest it quite at the first instance, there are halls that are incredibly rich in glazing, steel, and even these kind of hyper new technologies of, you know, hot air vents that come up from the ground in aluminum fittings. So it's every little assembly, every little bolt, it's articulated through the possibilities of these new innovations. But these are also architects who see architecture's role as bringing artistic innovation to functional conditions. None of these said, we'll give it to the engineers. All of them said, this is our role. We need to find the formal language that is adequate to an industrial age. And they have a lot of vocabularies that we still see today and still use today. And at the time, go through the old criticisms, you know, the Crystal Palace, many of these, there were definitely some very fierce reactions also at the reading room about this, you know, impossible new material that's meant for train stations. And how can we put that in such an institutional, important intellectual building as a library? These things shift. We now see it as one of the most beautiful library reading rooms in the world. Now, the 19th century had a lot of technical innovations, but the national identities were also radically shifting. You've got to imagine that in the 19th century, Germany went from like, I don't know, 57 dukedoms to like the one grand unified Germany. Young America was trying to find its ground as a nation. Viollet-le-Duc scored a lot of points with his students because he went back to medieval architecture to make his Dictionnaire raisonné of France, to talk about what the logic was of local building. So these national identities are beginning to be formed, and the big question is, where do we go for forms? In Germany, almost all of them went to der Alten. Semper went back to the Hellenic societies. Alois Hirt went to Greco-Roman. And there was actually a very banal social reason for this. Many of those beginning to teach in the not yet existing architecture schools were archaeologists. And from archaeology came the rhythm of the proper forms for architecture. So Alois Hirt went and, showed the Pantheon, went and picked apart also the structures of how all of it was put together. And not only that, gave his students the kind of handbook that showed every last little detailed articulation of a possible form referring back to the origins, again, this history of the Greco-Roman. In America, that's an interesting problem. Thomas Jefferson, well known for the University of Virginia, also well known for his Villa of Monticello, but this is the foundation for all American campuses right here. Teachers, big library, green in the middle. And Jefferson was very clear. We're a young nation. We just need to get from the best. We go straight back to the Greco-Roman era, and that gives us the foundation, the solidity, the stability. Now you hear how many things are being put into those forms, right? This is a shape that has gone on for a lot, but it takes a weight of history. And this is what Jefferson is hoping to bring in. Now, that works fantastically. He wrote many manifestos, and as president, of course, he had an influence. But there were others in that domain who said, okay, classical forms, okay, a Palladian door, a Palladio window, we can live with that. But we are in New England. We are in a young nation. We have no money. We have no materials. How can we make this achievable for this young nation? And so Asher Benjamin wrote first the country builder's assistant, fully explaining, et cetera, et cetera. His pattern book for the practical application of the 5 orders for carpenters and practical men was the subtitle. It's always aimed at local materials, the possibility to do it with a very low-key kind of construction. And they're pattern books. They are things that we probably were not doing quite as much at that point in Europe because we had the pattern books built around us in cities. He printed them out. Here is how you can make a very simple church with the plan of the pulpit and the ordering of the pews. Adapted to the local constructions, even into the details of the molding, and explained and illustrated every step of the way. So this was another aspect of that building identity through form. Take the old forms, adapt to the local materials and the local structures. But identity is a complicated thing. One of the architects that has completely fallen out of the canon in America, Frank Furness, he was typically attacked as gaudy and crass, troublesome, because really, what kind of style are we talking about? But he aims at it. This is the University of Pennsylvania Library. It has been revised, but it has been renovated by Venturian Scott Brown. But he really aimed at a kind of combination of cathedral and train station. It has to be high in intellectual inspiration, but it also has to be modern. And so you see these very funny and interesting things of the steel girders and a very decorative interior, but it's beautiful lighting. It's all built around activity, and history has not known what to do with it. Philadelphia, the man is well known. And outside of the Western world, there were also things going on, thanks to colleagues Francis Ching, Mark Jarzenbeck, and Vikram Prakash, who produced a global history of architecture in the last 10 years. There has been beautiful kind of opening up of other examples that had not yet landed in books. So I want to show a few of those examples, late 19th century, early 20th, just to give you a sense of it. This is the Hawa Mahal, where it's a blend of Hindu and Islamic styles. And this thing is literally just a windscreen. It's about a room full of depth because it was built for the women of the royal palace to be able to watch everything going on in the public space without being seen themselves. And in itself, it is not a radical architecture for that area. Many of these palaces had screened lattice sections. Many villas did. What was radical is this mass, 5 stories high, huge. This is a 19th century invention. We take what we know and we make it big enough for what we need. The Wat Prakau, Temple of the Emerald Buddha. I stuck this one in because I'm personally fascinated by it because it's not one temple, it's a complex. So the thing itself is a composite, and it was intended as a composite, but it was not only that, it was a combination, it was a fusion of cosmopolitan tastes, and it was in Thailand, which was not colonized. And so it was one of the few in that area that had a continuous development of its own formal language, where around that was happening less. The International Beaux-Arts went everywhere. This is a Belgian architect with a local Cuban architect who replicated more or less an Italian palazzo, adding a few things here and there, and generally basically trying to, have a lot of pomp and circumstance there for the presidential palace, which is now the Museum of the Revolution. And from the Netherlands, the former colony of Indonesia, the Bandung Institute of Technology, Henri Maclean Pont is known as one of the architects that did land in history books as someone who tried to bring together, say, Beaux-Arts, international style, and local Sumatran roofs with, for example, the more open trussed wood framing that we would find of an arts and crafts kind of construction. And in the drawings, we even kind of see these like 1920s modern kind of articulation. So this all to say that in that seeking for identity, it's very easy to keep it just to the kind of Western world, but this was going on, this kind of global shift was going on in many places. And I'm very happy to have colleagues in history who are opening that up for us in the discourse. The 20th century. Reshaping Society Part 2. We started this all going with the 19th century and technological innovations, but really, I don't think anyone could have predicted with what speed and what scale urbanization and industrialization would expand. So new materials for a new era, that's, this is another one of those. Is this a form or is it a manifesto? And this is how modernism put itself forward. The idea of glass was put in every possible iteration, in every form, to show what was all possible in the Werkbund and how glass would become the new modern material. So these materials would end up determining the face of architecture from there. And that was glass, and of course, who could do without it? Concrete. This is the Centennial Hall in Wrocław, which, just to give you the inside, embraced concrete in the fullest manner possible. And these spans, these masses, these incredible blocks of concrete, they provided new opportunities. We had reinforced concrete rising, but also people like Freycinet, who became famous with pre-stressed concrete, in these airship hangars experimented with a corrugated shape, which made it a very thin shell and still very sturdy. And these are the kind of modern formal languages that we have received, that we see as part of a kind of new experimentation. And the parabolic arches are no accident, of course. The engineering speaks from this. But what was even more radical at the time was the condition of urbanization and the belief that architecture could shape society. So we had new cities, new societies, new buildings. We were going to change the world. The skyscraper, that was an absolute element of that. In America, the skyscraper was the way forward. Corbett was somebody who was in New York actually looking at how skyscrapers were being shaped, and he presented these kind of dream fictions that we otherwise only really know in science fiction movies like Metropolis. And he was actually the person who commissioned Hugh Ferris to start looking at what zoning laws meant in terms of light. So this is someone who was aware that the skyscraper itself was going to determine the face of the cities, and was willing to actually get someone to draw out what that determining the face of would mean. And Ferris did series of these. I just gave the kind of first step, but he started, cutting it down and putting stepped versions, but it was all about getting light down to the ground and what that would mean for the shape of the skyscraper as it goes up. And on this continent, in the meantime, we had futurism, which in itself, if you haven't read the Declaration, I recommend it, but it ends basically, we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world. And after that 19th century that we just saw, these Enlightenment architects, we will destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, etc. So, for those who really wanted to radically reshape society, this is your gang. Now, they are very interesting to read because you can kind of feel that young, active power. They're like, war will obliterate everything we've got. That's great. Let's do it. 1909, they didn't know what they were asking for. And in fact, Marinetti, who ended up writing this manifesto, didn't last so long after the beginning of the war in terms of his fan base. But it showed some really radical visions for future cities. Sant'Elia produced this Città Nuova, who completely embraced the machine. This is the train station, but this is also a housing block with elevators that go all the way up. The idea that we would begin to live in this machine and that the formal language would become that of the machine. The machine or the masses? Massive blocks, that was an alternative. As rationally ordered with as little identification as possible. That's Hilbersheimer's version. Or, even more radically, Malevich's architectons, which were really built as what he called a non-objective, abstract form. And it would be possible to kind of construct almost whole cities in this, but there was no program, no function. It was form, pure form. And of course, this is because the Soviet Revolution had opened up a whole new vista of potentially changing the complete face of architecture and society. And you see that in the productions that they did at the time. We have Flying Cities at Vkutamas. We have the Monument to the Third International, which was never built, but absolutely envisioned as something incredibly large and unforgettable. But we also have a less, say, formalized radicalism, but in the typology of flats in the Narkomfen, they took all the kitchens out, they took the laundry out. It was meant to be communal, made the apartments smaller. And in that way, you see a kind of language of modernism extending with small kind of local particulars. But then comes that question. You were talking about formal expression. Can anybody read that this is a communist building? Taught by history or taught by language? But these are the discussions that I think are important to open, because this is also what starts happening precisely in the era after, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, in rethinking modernism. What the architects at that time are doing are saying, okay, this abstraction and this non-figuration and this idea of pure form that doesn't have a kind of social connotation but does have a behavioral approach, doesn't do justice to kind of the thoughts you have about spaces. This is what the Venturis dug into. They said, you know, I mean, this is part of an exhibition they did in 1976, and they didn't only draw what, you know, it said, but they also drew what it meant by using those thought bubbles. You know, this kind of nice little American drive off into the sunset through the curving street and no curb. These kinds of ideas were part of what was hoping to be conveyed in these images. And this was the argument against modernism of the question, can we live with pure abstraction? Symbolism might also well be part of our formal language. We all know what that led to, postmodernism, the Portland building, or even better, the Disney caryatids. And this is part of that story of pushing back at the white walls of modernism and looking for a new formal articulation, but this one doesn't go to form, it goes to symbols. And the interesting part of that is that actually one of the better thinkers in England, Alan Colquhoun, puts forward form follows figure. It was a suggestion that it's not about function or geometry, but the idea of the figure he pulled from rhetoric, the idea that each word we have, each form that we put forward is also embedded in a series of conventions, in a social history, in a background. And for him, that was the first kind of moment in architecture theory that we start to re-anchor all of these things into a discussion that is historical, local, social, etc. And it's that anchoring that begins to maybe bring some things forward. I can't, in the Rethinking Modernism, it's a personal favorite of mine. John Haydock is, you can't kind of ignore him because he went from the kind of very classic modern spaces and 9-square problems into taking those elements and exaggerating them and putting them together into something like the Wall House, which was built way up in Groningen. And from there, his architecture becomes more and more a character itself. It has a plethora of forms. There is no like particular formal language you can find here, but each and every one of the elements in his masks has a script, a name, a character, a shape, a color, and he articulates these more and more in a series of sketches and watercolors, etc. Now, for that time, that was a lot of pushback from modernism, but I think what today is about, or at least the way I took your question, Rick, is about recalibrating this kind of question of form and figure, or as Koolhaas calls it, a plausible relation between the social and the formal. Something that can be connected, but isn't definitive. Something that can also be reinserted with other kinds of content. And for that, I just want to share a few images that those who know my work will know. Ungers put an exhibition together called City Metaphors, in German, the Morphologie, where he talks really about the kind of way our brain is structured. He pulls this almost out of Gestalt psychology and his own architectural history work. But he takes old city plans from the history of architecture together with an image that to him resonates with what it conveys. And he puts words at the bottom to make a literal kind of verbal conveying of that material. So he has protection, he has radiation, appendages, and there's a series of these things. There was a whole hall full of these kind of combinations of photographs, words, structures that allowed us to kind of rethink this very narrow focus of what kind of content is in what kind of shape. And it's at that point that, to me, the work on the book on Ungers and Koolhaas starts, because what we also see, for example, in 75, they are both competitors in a renovation of Roosevelt Island in New York, and they both take Manhattan as their departure point. Ungers shrinks it down and replicates it. We've got Central Park, and we've got a bunch of blocks around it. And in those blocks are a kind of encyclopedic iterations of possible shapes of blocks. And Koolhaas and Zengelis take the lines of the Manhattan streets, draw them out, and make a massive new kind of skyscraper, constructivist condenser on the block. So you see these kind of separations that come from the same departure point, and both have a language of urbanism, of history, but in very, very different ways. And it's on that level that, to me, Koolhaas has always been an interesting architect, because he was treated as the writer, the scriptwriter, the journalist, the filmer, et cetera, but not really as the architect. But his drawing back on the shapes of history, the architecton right there, the super studio over there, his continual conversation with history also meant that his architecture was taking shape in the context of that anchored formal, not just a completely geometric formal. And I think we saw that happen again when he took on the Biennale as a curation project, when he said, the elements of architecture, these are the things that are becoming increasingly prefabricated, so let's look at these things in detail and see what that tells us about the kind of formal work that we still have as architects. So then the question, what now? Now, I told you already I don't have answers, so I don't feel compelled to give any answers. But I do have two little interesting examples, at least to me interesting. In 2008, Francois Blanciac produced a book with MIT Press that is called Sightless, 1,001 Forms of Architecture. And it literally has no function, no program, no indication, no historical foundation, but it's a riff. It's a riff on shapes. Pixel circle, acoustic slab, pebble square. I mean, they say what they are. And in a way, I think that is a condition that we are dealing with today, that buildings in some ways are just a riff on forms that we know. And the question is, should we? But it's at least an interesting one. And the other example that I couldn't resist is the condition of iconic architecture, but not so much this part, but this part. Because Madelon Friesendorp, in conversation with Jenks, in, so say, between 10 and 15, she did her iconic drawings to talk about what these icons might also mean. And to me, this is when we get into things like the plausible relation between the social and the formal. Norman Foster had his thing. He did his thing. But Madelon Friesendorp sees a matryoshka, maybe, or a finger, maybe, a screw, possibly. And likewise, she kind of takes the Guggenheim and from the wastepaper basket moves on until we end up with Marilyn Monroe. And to me, these are good examples of how we can take a lighthearted walk through history and talk maybe not so much about what architecture definitely means in this form, but maybe also acknowledge the limitations and acknowledge that there is a need for care in the built environment, for considerate and thoroughness, and that from there, what we do is we aspire to move beyond the time and the message that we put in it. So to me, that's maybe the most important task we have before us, to continue these iterations of formal expression, knowing that they will never be exactly the message that we put in them to start with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. I would like to open up the conversation a little bit to the audience as well, but maybe to start off, I would like to ask Greg to respond or to ask the first question. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, first of all,
Is it comfortable to stand here or maybe uncomfortable? Then
no, I'll release.
Maybe we should
Yeah,
all
okay.
just put chairs up here. I don't know.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
also fine. Yeah. Well,
But here, I'll grab a couple chairs.
wait, I'll take the higher one.
Yeah.
Leave the chair. There we go.
Doesn't mean that everybody asking a question.
We just want to make sure that Rick stays mobile.
Yeah, I needed to stand up anyway. Yeah.
I'm gonna. Well,
Yeah, so first of all, thanks. It's nice because like when we had these types of lectures at the university, I was kind of too busy thinking about other things and where I had to go afterwards, so I wasn't always paying attention that well. So this is highly refreshing and informative. And I think it's also an alternative take on what we usually learned, because it was really about the canon,
Yeah.
all of it, and mostly about modernism.
I put in a little effort today to not have only the usual suspects.
Yeah.
'Cause, it's very easy with a concrete question to put another slab of Le Corbusier in there, but it's kind of nice to move around it. And it's also a conversation that with academic colleagues we're having, and I love what Jarzenbeck has done with the global history of architecture, because they teamed up also with teams in different areas so that there was just much more richness.
Yeah.
And that helps move the conversation forward.
Yeah. Well, it's like the type of reference that we, at least at the office, are always fascinated by. We're not always fully aware of the context or like how it's anchored, like you put it. I guess one of the things that I would be interested in is that angle. Like, okay, the examples that you've shown are all, in a way, attempts to express something in a relatively universal manner. Like, this is the expression of whatever, the machine age, or the expression of this, or the expression of that. And you show that different national identities come to different results. Mm-hmm. In a time where, well, the national identity is something almost dangerous, you could argue, and it's at least something that's highly diverse and relative. I wonder if you could say anything about how architects should deal with that. Like, should we just mix up a bunch of references from this world architecture history, or like, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have one thought, which is talk to the clients and look around you. I mean, I really do believe that one of the ways to get ourselves in trouble in this discipline is to work only from the abstract. And it's because of that I really like the idea of like materializing these ideas, because you can then talk about what it means at this point. just last week, I saw a lecture of Jos Boyce from Matrix Architects, one of the kind of famous feminist collectives of the 80s. And they're very well known for this kind of Indian women's shelter where they worked with the women who were going to be occupying it to, in a very low-key way, very low-key. They needed, it was the 80s in London, so they needed kind of steel grating against the windows for safety. But they also kind of started to shape that in a way, the way Ajay also does that with his wrought iron, these ornamental panels. And they wouldn't have known, this is something they also write about, like they wouldn't have had an idea for this kind of symbolic value. But it was in these conversations with women who said, you know, well, I don't know if this is important, but, you know, and so especially when someone says, I don't know if this is important, that's the time to open your ears. and I think, I mean, I do think that the work I've seen of Civic is already successfully at least trying to kind of get into a space and see what value there could be for many different people. But for example, the example you gave of someone who says, I feel excluded with these glass walls. Now that's a beautiful thing to take into your practice and think about.
Definitely. Yeah. It's also talking to mostly users, because clients are usually a bit more like they have their formal rules that they need to apply. It's checking boxes, but mostly the users or the community. It's also a way to actually, at least in my experience, deal with the fact that users obviously don't have this sort of historical context inside, so they don't always understand your, I don't know, the meaning behind a certain design. And it's not only listening to them and then doing what they're saying, because they don't always know what it's a dialogue. So it's sometimes also explaining to them, okay, the reason why this shape or thing looks the way it does is because of this and this and this. And then all of a sudden, they're super happy about it.
Yep.
And sometimes they're not, and they say like, oh, no, I'm still really radically opposed to what you're proposing here. And this dialogue is super interesting.
I think Cruz and Foreman at the Tijuana border do a lot of this kind of stakeholder architecture. And they were also saying that in their work, they end up doing a lot of front-loaded design, talking to the community, because they say, you know, the people who live there know how they live, and we know how to make that into a space. And that's the kind of back and forth that you get that can be really valuable.
Could you maybe explain, or tell a little, of course you showed the examples already of the projects, but how you work in the office, and when making this type of projects, how you take this into account, because a lot of them are competition entries, right? So at the start, you don't talk with, not so much with the client, not so much with the users either. What do you do with it?
That's a good question. So in a lot of tenders that we win, maybe this is a weakness of our office, but quite a few of the tenders that we win are so-called vision tenders. And in these vision tenders, it's a little bit less about like the formal expression of a building and more about certain conceptual thoughts, or at least ways that you answer their questions. So for instance, in the university building, our proposal was actually not much more than, well, whatever, this idea of hollowing out this building with a bunch of atriums. And then a whole story about how these atriums were enhancing the quality of light and air, etc., and how we could organize the entire program around it. So all the different types of program, labs and you know, education spaces and offices could interact with each other, and the professors could interact with the students, etc. And we had a story about where the entrance was situated. This was basically what we came up with based on, this is I think important if you ask me about how we work, extensive research also outside of the context of the brief. Like, okay, what's the history of this site? What type of users are there? Because it's a kind of a specific university faculty with mostly postgraduate students coming from second and third world countries. So that's an aspect, really extensively researching before you propose something. And another aspect I think is important in our office is the fact that we don't design alone. So it's not only the four partners that continuously talk to each other, but it's also the people that work with us. And it's like an ongoing discussion. And I think that helps at least a little bit to overcome this sort of these
blind
singular perfect ideas and try to achieve something that's a little bit more open. That then enables you, if you win the competition and start the actual design process, to on the one hand keep up the sort of main idea or something that we believe really gives the project its quality, and at the same time be open to an evolution of the project in response to the questions and actually the response by users is never about, or hardly ever about, like how it literally looks. Mm-hmm. They don't really dare to speak out about that too much. They think they don't, they're not professionals. What they talk about a lot is functionality, obviously. Like, where do I sit? Does the door open, etc. And something that's slightly more vague, atmosphere, like materials, feeling, and you can deal with that in a very effective way with just bringing a bunch of materials and talking to them. But really talking about, like, should this line be diagonal or horizontal?
That is not a conversation that
No.
you necessarily need to have with users. That's like your part of the table.
Yeah, but that is true. But then, so for instance, in Brussels, I could have. It would have been interesting if we would have dived deeper into the fact that the users were basically all don't have European heritage. Let's phrase it like that. Mm-hmm. And instead, we went for a sort of architecture as an expression of a material strategy, and less something that really deals with, for instance, Moroccan heritage or.
I mean, it's an open question to me whether it always needs to be that. I mean, at times it's also about how a space is accessible.
Yeah.
And whether it's sufficiently accessible that it becomes claimed by those around.
True.
And I do hope, I guess, because it's relevant to this field, I do hope that the choices that are made about shapes and forms and spaces and compositions affect that, but you can't always predict that. So, I mean, in a way, it's a very multi-layered process that just needs to remain. This is why I loved that phrase of the plausible relation, because it's not a direct, I mean, this is the fundamental issue over history with this idea that there's a direct correlation between form and meaning, because we know on so many levels that has failed in so many ways.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of thing that enough people can latch onto that makes it worth recuperating and reappropriating.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was wondering that maybe what makes it so hard now or what would make it hard for me if I were an architect to talk about, to think about representation and the relationship between form and meaning and public buildings, etc., is that it seems that right now architecture is so incredibly unpolitical or so unpoliticized. If you compare it to the post-war period, for example, if you would use a certain formal language, you would immediately have chosen a certain political program, a certain rhetoric, a certain political party even. You would have chosen for a certain, or you would be part of a certain generation. an example that Michelle has written extensively about of the provincial the state house of Brabant by Maaskant, which was completely built in the modern canon, but it was so monumental and so symmetrical in ways that a younger generation of critics called it fascist. And on the other, but also that's buildings that were in the postmodern, of which there are very few realized in the Netherlands, buildings in the postmodern collage-like for formal language would be dismissed as being commercial or American, Disney, Coca-Cola, and so on. And also modernist buildings would then be swiped away as being bureaucratic and mute and etc. But this all has to do with that architecture was completely wound up in generational conflicts, in political party politics, in these kinds of things. And now it's accepted as culture, you know. And so it has lost, it doesn't hurt anymore in that way. It doesn't split people apart anymore. Except maybe in elite and non-elite. That you belong to the elite if you appreciate modernist architecture, and you do not belong to the elite if you don't. So that's more or less the only kind of polarization that you can achieve with a building right now. Don't you miss polarization?
Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm personally not
You're trying
the
not
type
to.
type of person that really is into polarization.
Just let's go through this.
No, but I think, well, it's in a way like the examples that you give. They're all indeed like you choose a formal language and it's directly related to a certain political stance. I'm personally kind of happy that that is not the case anymore. I would say that like the performative, the performance of a building, the functional quality of a building should be highly political. Like say a building that is or is not accessible, that should be highly politicized and maybe a bit less how it looks. Like if it looks that way, it's right wing, and if it looks that way, it's left wing. I personally find this freedom to work with different shapes and different forms.
So that's progress.
Well, I'm not sure. Let's not discuss whether progress is possible, but
It's changed.
it's changed. I kind of I'm quite happy that not every formal direction is directly related to a certain political direction. Yeah.
Well, and plus I do think, I mean, it depends also where you are. I think in Holland, this kind of polarization was much bigger in the post-war than in many other places. And I think that kind of radicalism is not necessarily healthy for the, I mean, it looks like a good debate, but it's really keeps people entrenched.
Yeah.
And so in a way, this is a more rich kind of setting where there's more possibilities. The political, I would dare question whether architecture is unpolitical now. Architects who are shifting into other roles are taking on a political role, but it's not the kind of like expression of a political role that maybe we've been used to in the last 30, 40 years. But I see certainly a younger Flemish generation that's being quite radical in new typologies, in reuse, in one of our favorite firms in Belgium now is Rest, because they say the best building is none, you know, because it doesn't produce any carbon.
I totally agree.
And so in a way, there's a lot of radicality, but it's stepping away from the shapes of these things and into the structure and the system. Which
does someone in the audience recognize this or completely opposes to it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is I was thinking that you said it's not political, no, I would say it is political. Maybe from inside it's a bit difficult to judge at the moment, but I think it is of course shifting from modernism, the scale, look at the shape of society, and that's much more focused on the people, on the reuse, on sustainability. This is also of course political choice. So I think it's shifting towards that. So it still remains political, but you just have a different way of much more that in a way. But it still exists different. Let's say, it's still like more traditional. Architects also still embrace their direction, more traditional, more conservative. Well, maybe we talk about it last.
Do you have an idea that that also produces a different type of representation of buildings?
Yeah, but this is the presentation is also focus.
Yeah.
It's political focus that you could be more represented. If you want to represent people, users, the team, or whatever. So it's also political choice.
Here you see also an interesting difference between Belgium and the Netherlands, for instance. Like in the Netherlands, it's the easiest way to check all the sustainability boxes in a tender, for instance, is to just add a layer of sustainability, either in just techniques or whatever. We're not really allowed to experiment wildly with a differently shaped architecture because clients, I don't know, they don't feel the need to give us this freedom to experiment. While in Belgium, and we noticed this in the project that I've shown in Brussels, you just have way more freedom to go hardcore radical with for instance, doing a dome or an arch in a building phase where in the Netherlands people would totally panic. But this freedom is just not there in the Netherlands.
We've got a fairly rigid structure. What did you?
I was just going to say that I don't think it's diverse at all, because I think it's very much catering to everyone or catering to this one idea of what it should be or just a general thought. I think it's a little bit saddening because if you're talking about symbolic representation, and it was already put forward in these lectures a few months ago here on Queer Spaces, that it is not at all, at least open to symbolic representation, because when it does, it's seen usually as like out there, screamy, like very radical, while it's just a different idea. And I find this example very nice because it's just a funny way to put forward, oh, it's just aesthetics that we connect to certain ideas. And that these aesthetics are just a difference of opinion. And I like that a lot. And I think at the moment, it's really not diverse at all, because it's simpled down to just an aesthetic that is general and not diverse, which becomes like it's more singular than different, in my opinion.
This is kind of an issue, I think, throughout architecture history. I mean, let's be completely and utterly clear about that. Architecture is a white, male, heteronormative, privileged, upper class field. Did I miss anything there? This is because I mean I've actually, you know, I've dug up photographs of the old École des Beaux-Arts and things like that, and I mean you have to take them out of magnifying glass to find the women. There might be a gay guy in there, but we don't know that.
And if so, they are not.
They're certainly not going to show it.
Yeah, exactly. So.
And so there is, in many ways, and then we never, I think we far too rarely talk about the class privilege as well, because it is expensive to study architecture, and it has been for a long time. And it has a lot of social conventions and norms that you need to adhere to. And so on that level, there's a beautiful book about that by Gary Stevens, Australian critic, called The Favored Circle. And that one's from like '94, but it still holds in many ways for the mechanisms for today. And so that is something that we also need to talk about. But to me, they're like related but separate conversations that you can have about the canon of formal articulation and the diversity of the field in the profession. I mean, I'm certainly, don't even get me started on the leaky pipeline. Women just drop off as the further you go. But they're kind of combined activities. And I think, to me right now, one of the things that is superseding a lot is the climate emergency. So that kind of takes on a lot of the conversations about inclusion and diversity, because we haven't yet found a way to bring those conversations together. And there are a few really interesting critics out there doing that, talking about care for planet, for people, for, you know, and care as a mode of architecture design. But to do that, you need time. Time does not fit in a European tender. And so these things, to me, are kind of the new conversation that need to
But I find it kind of weird, because it almost sounds like a new reason for aesthetics when you say that, because you just also just said something about the users, and it doesn't necessarily correlate, like something, I forgot the correlation about form and
Figure.
Or what users see in that. But there are a few studies in Thailand about community architects that convey architecture to communities that were in sloppenwijken,
Yeah, in the slums.
and they were being pretty much transferred to new neighborhoods that were made by the government. And these community architects had to help make their new neighborhoods more something they would want to see. And they made choices, and these community architects were like there for once a year, so it wasn't even that extensive. But these communities could choose, for example, if they wanted uniformity or something totally different or whatever. And by making those choices, they were at least more happy with the new social fabric they were coming into. And I find it quite interesting, at least by giving these people the choice, or at least a power in the choice, they can have more say into it and be more happy with their spaces that they are going to use.
Yeah. But see, this is a new iteration of, because participatory design has been, you just said it in a way that's like straight out of Dutch history. Not this participation where they say what we do and we do it. And that's a very particular Dutch perception of what participatory design is. Whereas what you're describing is what one might consider actual participatory design. We go into dialogue, and each brings in their own expertise. The users know what they want, and you know what to create, and somewhere in between is what happens. This is what I think Matrix, showed at a certain point. They really, and they were also, I keep talking about front-loaded design processes. I think that's one of the qualities in Flanders. The Vlaams Bouwmeester has basically said, we take this much time for client, user, architect. What do you need? What do you want? What are you looking for? And that way we make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page instead of give us an idea. And
it's still tender in a way. The procedure has been lauded and everybody's wildly enthusiastic. Sometimes I also feel a bit like, because it's something else. But because if you participate, you just need to hand in the best design, and then you win, and then a fairly conventional process starts where you do have more freedom as an architect. Actually, way more than in the Netherlands. So you can actually tell users to fuck off because you're the architect. You're a way more powerful figure, in my experience, as an architect in Belgium, in relation to users, than you are in the Netherlands, actually. I like to correct a little bit the impression that participatory trajectories in the Netherlands are like about listening and then ignoring and doing whatever you want. It is a dialogue. It's just that what I find maybe sad, or at least in our practice is hard to do, is to talk with users about shape and about form. And that could be us, that we just are limited somehow to have this discussion. But yeah, in my experience, it's actually quite hard to do that. So this example that you give, like, can people literally influence how the building looks? I would be super interested in getting to learn how to do that. But,
I mean, how wonderful it would be if we had community architects just in Dijken, or just
Yeah.
in neighborhoods. I mean, it would be a whole different conversation, I think.
yeah.
Hey,
I may be saying something that will get me lips. I'm a graphic designer, so I'm not an architect, right? So I do think, I'm always surprised about how much control architects think they have about symbols. It's basic semiotics, that half of it's denotation, that other half is connotation.
Yeah.
The punctums, as Bart called it. So I think it's maybe a discussion that you don't really have control over. I do very much like Rick's sort of openness and earnestness in presenting it and saying, well, we just don't know this and we're not ready with this. And I think that could be very constructive. I think it's certainly very refreshing.
yeah.
I think it's just to share a thought I have about the importance of the architectural brief. I think in history of architecture, we always put attention on the architect and the final building, but there's like this credit missing to what happened before the architect. What's the origin, like the actual origin of architecture tends to be, as you said, listen to the client, talk to the client. So what about the brief? Like, I don't know, I wanted to ask you on your research and your whole architectural history research, I think we need to pay more attention to the brief, because sometimes innovative architecture really didn't happen because of the architect, but because of an architect that could really translate a proper brief into a final shape or figure or form, or however you want to call it. So I would like, I don't know.
No, that's an excellent point. I think really good patrons have been a very important part of innovations in architecture, but also good clients. Or also good like users who intervene, who say, who are really engaged in the activity. I think what's hard to me in the research, there's when you really can trace a building from its very beginning to its very end, you can bring that in, but it's certainly hasn't been done to my knowledge before. It's usually reflections by architecture firms on their processes, and that in and of itself can be very informative. I don't even know how we begin to take that in, but it could be an interesting way to approach it.
I know, mainly like competitions, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, I don't know, maybe for the next Biennale.
There we go.
The idea of the origin of the building, if we go back to the brief, happened before the competition was won. We don't look at that often.
But maybe in that context, I was also thinking in your lecture, you showed a lot of paper plans, right? A lot of just ideas, and also this whole thing of making paper plans that are not per se a competition entry or not per se something that is supposed to be realized, but just making architecture as a way of thinking, as a way of representing or drawing up how you think the world should be, like without a client.
I think there's a lot of creativity out there, certainly at every time of economic crisis. There is much paper architecture, which is really valuable to the way that the discipline shifts and changes.
We missed that a bit. Huh?
I missed it.
The last crisis.
We're coming into another one, so don't worry, it'll be fun.
A lot of practice.
Yeah.
But there's not so much paper architecture being made.
No, but maybe we should also not forget also the ephemeral practices, because that's something that's coming out a lot right now in the feminist discussion on architecture, is that a lot of the practices that were in the high point of, say, second wave feminism, 70s, 80s, experimental, had very little paper plans and were being built in cooperative workshops. So those are also not in the canon. because, you know, we don't have anything to hold on to except for, so I guess to me, I mean, when I look at my discipline, it's about kind of trying to open up to these different, different forms of histories, I guess, and trying to understand these patterns in relation to their social context. But it could be, I mean, it could definitely have briefs and paper plans and, you know, building workshops. We have a few of those here and there.
Maybe do one or two more questions, and Jean-Michel on this one.
Yeah, something in between a question and a remark. Because, yeah, I really like that it's this first evening that dives back into history, but also into many different interpretations of what we could actually talk about when we now talk about representation.
Yeah, it's shifting every day in my head as well.
But it's in your introduction, there were all these different approaches, and yeah, these are all viable angles. But one thing we didn't talk about so much, which is, you mentioned it, beauty, which is definitely an aspect of all this, this thinking about representation. And it struck me that in the work that you showed, there's actually such a well-defined and understandable idea of beauty and aesthetics, that also when you put your work in the line that Lara described, fits perfectly actually in the modernist tradition. Yeah, it's kind of funny that you were mentioning this, like that you were brought up in this modernist tradition. But if you look at this from the 19th century and then on to the 20th, that is something very important, I think, that artists always wanted to represent their time and the inventions of their time, the technical innovation of their time, and that they wanted to shape society of their time. And I think that's probably also what you are doing, because you've tried to define what in this era is actually valuable as an ingredient for architecture, and what you are picking out is sustainability and reuse and public openness and invitingness, and that's what I see in your buildings. So that means, yeah, there's a strong line there that you can recognize, and maybe that's also, if you talk about polarization, that's what puts you in another strand of architecture than the more historical, or the architects that use a historical style, and that also, yeah, creates a polarization between sort of your brand of architecture and the other brand that is selling itself by the historical images that we are presently seeing in abundance. So I do see a tradition where you fit in, and there is a polarization within styles and aesthetics and beauty. And of course, that I forgot the name of the French philosopher that made this connection between class and taste. But I think
Bourdieu.
Yeah, Bourdieu.
Yeah.
But that's what we're also seeing now.
Yeah, this habitus.
So you're saying it's not so much a stylistic relation to modernism, but it's this idea of trying to somehow express what is relevant in society.
Yeah, to express today and not yesterday, and not some kind of historic period.
Well, that could be true. It's indeed, at least it's something that we are attempting in a way, giving expression, but also, functional value and performative value to things that are happening right now and that we should address. There is, in the office, also always this discussion about how it looks, not as a one-on-one result of this strategy that you are talking about, but also in relation to other buildings of other historical periods. What I think might make us different is that the references change per building. So sometimes these references could indeed be modernist buildings, because maybe we're working in a university that consists of in Twente, for instance, of a typical like modernist campus with a green landscape and machine-like buildings in it. And there's also a structuralist period in that campus, and then we try to kind of combine these two. In other buildings, the references might be from a different style, but they're never, I guess, super explicit in the architecture that is the final result, is the end result. But it is something that we talk a lot about, and that we use a lot of references. And then one of the things that we always try to do is not to, I don't know, copy them or whatever, or just interpret them in a quite a literal way, but we always like to give it a certain shift, or like, we're all, at least I'm personally interested in things that look slightly ugly, and because I think those are really aesthetic. I like that.
I was actually going to respond to the beauty comment with, my favorite Instagram page right now is Keep Rotterdam Ugly.
Yeah.
Because really we talk about beauty as something we aspire to, but when there's too much beauty, it gets a little claustrophobic too.
It's a lost cause.
Maybe one more question. If there's any. Yeah. Sure.
You started off with technological innovation and driver, and you were referring to the attempt to find universal meaning in architecture like that. And the more hopeful references you show in the end, where you refer to a plausible relationship between meaning and interpretation, I cannot see it different than being very much a personal interpretation of architectural meaning. And call me naive or hopeful, I don't know how to call it, but this sense of universal, search for universal meaning, do you think it's a lost cause anyway too, for that matter? Because reading, for instance, Ogiati's book a while ago was almost, he's very cynical about it.
Yeah, I can't.
People having possibilities to have universal experience.
But this is a very interesting point you raise, because I think we're ready to start addressing that point head on now. I do not necessarily believe in universal meaning as an identifiable kind of form. There's too much variety in the world to think about that. What I do think is that there are kind of resonances in response that are shared. So when you talk about something, massive, it's very, very few people go, oh, what a cute little building. They're all like, and so there are these almost physical responses that I do think we share in the face of very particular kind of articulations. And that might have to do with sunlight, it might have to do with green, it might have to do with massive, but I think my biggest concern is that architectural history has taken a very narrow interpretation of these responses and seen them as the universal. And so when I take something like this, I love this, because Friesendorp is expressing affection for just the fact of this thing here. And that affection articulates in many different forms. And I can imagine that there's almost anyone in this space will find one that they think, oh yeah. And that's the thing that I'm aiming at. I don't think that's universal meaning. I do think it's a shared experience.
But what does that say about this building? I mean, her interpretation is something that you find...
It says that she's a whole lot better telling us what that means than... But...
I was hoping that the Gert's question, you could also argue, like, okay, in a time where people don't have like a shared reference or a shared language in terms of architecture, buildings that directly touch the senses could be this attempt at achieving something universal. And then years ago, I visited the Colomba Museum, which is to me still one of the most impressive contemporary buildings that at least I've ever visited. And I was sure that my experience was everybody's experience. Like, oh, the light is coming from there and it feels mystical and this feels enclosed. And then I was there with my girlfriend and she was totally unimpressed. So it's like, didn't do anything to her. So that, yeah, that idea also evaporated very quickly.
But this is what philosophers use the term intersubjectivity for. You know, I mean, there's a certain level of shared experiences that you can identify because there are discussions that have been done long enough. And to me, that's what something like these iconic buildings that we still hold in our hearts have. Because and it's not just tourist streams, it's also just people who go somewhere because they feel it's somehow a powerful building, whatever that meaning might be.
Yeah.
And to me, so, and when you talk about a shared vocabulary that we've lost, I mean, that was Noteling's comment 10, 15 years ago, that has been lost since the post-war. But I think a shared presence in and of itself, you don't have to share a vocabulary if you share a space, and you can learn from that. So to me, it's also about shifting our talking about it and thinking about how we are there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely time. Yeah.
If you want, we can continue the conversation at the bar still. Also, looking forward to see at least Rick again, and hopefully a lot of you as well on the 25th of April when we continue this conversation.
And don't you guys also have next week architect verb? Because
Yeah,
I think that ties into this conversation a lot.
Next week, yeah, well,
And-
yeah,
Yeah, no.
yeah. Next week we have on Tuesday.
Wednesday.
We'll have a conversation between Wouter and Michelle with Reinier de Graaf.
That book is exactly about this.
Architecture verb about language and architecture.
And the emptiness of all those words that they use in all those European briefs.
And the ruinous effect of that building.
Well, that too.
Because it causes so many other cities to think we can also have the Bilbao effect.
Next time I'll just leave that one out and just show that.
And hopefully we'll see you on the 25th as well. Yeah, thank you.
Het is wel leuk in zo'n kleine club.